Welcome back, everyone. So we're going to finish off the term with animal structure and function from chapter 11. I believe it's chapter 20 in the Campbell Biology book, but I'm not quite sure. So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at basically the beginnings of anatomy and physiology, so that, probably next term you're going to be taking an anatomy and physiology course. So this will give you kind of a preview, the basics that you'll need to be successful. And so in this chapter, we're going to start out, we're going to skip 11.1. If you look at 11.1, it's just an introduction. So basically it just talks about the summary of the three sections of the chapter. So we're going to be taking a look at the structures of animals, and if you take a look at our series here, we're going to look at the primary tissues that make up more complex organs and organ systems, and then we're going to finish off with homeostasis. And we've been talking a lot about homeostasis throughout the term, just from our worksheets. So it should be, good review, put the pieces together. Okay, so in this section, we're going to start out with 11.2 in animal form and function. So in animal form and function, we're going to look at how animals vary in form and function. So if you think about a sponge, it's this animal that basically is asymmetrical to like a goat that you see here, or a human being that's, we have, if we cut us in half, we have two equal sides to us. Each organism, we each have a distinct body plan that limits the size and shape. So we're going to describe the various types of body plans that occur in animals and the limits on animal size and shape. We'll also relate bioengineerics to body size, level of activity, and the environment, so that we can see how our bodies are designed to interact with our environments, and so that whether it's living in the deep oceans or a desert or a rainforest, we all have ways that our bodies can interact with the environment and get the necessary nutrients and waste into our cells, and nutrients into our cells and dispel the waste that are out of our cells correctly. So we'll talk all about that in this video. Okay, so let's start out by talking about animal form and function. So as I described already, so an organism has a distinct body plan that limits its size and shape. So we know that we cannot have basically organisms, we have to be able to maintain a certain size and shape. So there is a limit to that ability. We can't have for example, an animal, terrestrial animal, that is too big, because of the weight could act on gravity, and it might make it difficult to move and so forth. So if you think about what's the largest animal on Earth, it's a blue whale. And where does it live? It lives in the ocean. So that large blue whale that's like larger than a school bus, probably I don't remember the exact size, but it's really, really big. And, it can survive because of the buoyancy in the ocean that allows it to be able to be that big. But something like that can't really be in the land because of, the forces of gravity and so forth. Animals' bodies are designed to interact with their environment, so we have to be able to take in our nutrients, take in water, take in gas, oxygen, and then be able to expel waste products. So be able to, exhale our carbon dioxide and so forth. So knowing this, we can actually study an organism's environment to learn a lot about the organism's form and function. So for example, just looking here at this Arctic fox, you can see how the Arctic fox, it's perfectly blended into the snow environment. So it has that, that coloration, the white coloration that during the winter months it actually is a white color, but then during the summer months the Arctic fox's coat is more of a brown color, or a dark gray color, to kind of camouflage in with the landscape without snow. So it has that adaptation. You can also notice that the Arctic fox is a predator, so it has the ears are pointed forward, its eyes and nose are pointed forward instead of on the peripheral like our prey species. You can see the thick fur to help keep them warm during the winter and so forth. So there's a lot of different things that we can just observe that this organism, this Arctic fox, has adapted, has adaptations to allow it to survive in its environment. Okay. So we're going to start out by talking about body plans. So what is a body plan? So an animal's body plan follows a set of patterns related to symmetry. So we're going to talk about the three main types of body plans that we see in animals. So we have asymmetrical, radial, and bilateral. So the first one is asymmetrical. So asymmetrical is basically, it's the opposite of symmetry, asymmetry. So no pattern or symmetry. So animals that are with no pattern or symmetry, you can see an example of here with the sponge. So you might think, hey, a sponge is an animal? Yeah, so it's a very ancient animal. It's a very early phyla called Porifera, and this particular organism, it basically binds to a substrate and it lives its life on that substrate. So even though it is it looks kind of like in between like a coral and a, I don't know, plant or something like that, or fungus, it is an animal. It has the characteristics of an animal. But you can see that it's asymmetrical. So if I was to cut it vertically, I would get the halves would not be equal. If I horizontally, the halves would not be equal. So any way I cut this, I would not receive equal sides to it. So that's why we call it asymmetrical. Okay. With radial symmetry, some of our animals are radially symmetrical. So that means that they have kind of an up-down orientation. So usually these type of animals will be bound to some sort of substrate. So think of like a sea anemone or a sea urchin, or even like a sea star. They're radially symmetrical. So these type of organisms, they have kind of that up-down orientation, where if I was to cut it on any of these planes from a longitudinal axis, I would get two equal sides. Okay, so these are more common again with more of the aquatic animals that are attached to like a rock or some sort of substrate. And the reason why that this radial symmetry works really well is because if you think about it, if they're surrounded by water, water is passing over them, so they can extract nutrients from all around them. Okay, so this allows them to extract food from their surrounding water as it flows past them. So like this sea anemone, for example, it's got tentacles all around, right? So as the water's passing through, it can extract food items from the water. Okay, so this is a good adaptation for those aquatic animals. And then finally we have bilateral symmetry. So bilateral symmetry is basically where we have, if we can cut from front to back and separate the animal's right side from left side. Okay. And this type of symmetry is especially useful for both land and aquatic type animals, but particularly animals that are have high level of mobility. So if you think about, a goat, goats walk around, right? So they're very mobile. They're walking around, whereas something like a sea anemone is just going to be attached to a substrate. So they do move, but not very often. Okay. And like a sponge is basically just stuck there. So these type of animals are with bilateral symmetry. They're designed for movement, right? So they're walking around, being able to move, and so that bilateral symmetry allows them better level of mobility. And just as we get into our terminology, and you'll see a lot more of this terminology in the lab, we do use a certain set of terminology to locate certain parts of the body, and so you'll need to get used to that. So when we refer to something as anterior on an organism, that means like the front of the organism. Okay, so for example, the goat's chest is anterior to its tail. Okay, so it's the frontal portion. Posterior would be the rear portion of the organism. So in this case, the tail is posterior to the chest of the goat. Okay. Dorsal would be towards the back of the animal, and ventral would be towards the front. So when we're talking about a human being, you can think of like your dorsal would be your back and your ventral would be like your chest front area. But on a goat, we're thinking of it as, the back of the goat versus the belly of the goat. So the ventral portion would be the belly. The dorsal portion would be the back. So it's just because they walk on all four legs. It's a little bit different positioning than us humans, where we have our ventral is towards our chest and belly. When we're standing upright, it would be forward, and then backward would be the dorsal. Okay, instead of up for the goat and down for the ventral would be down for the goat. Okay. Right. So as far as body plans, we know that our animal size and shape, there's some limits to that. So we know with animals, if we think of like our mobile animals, our terrestrial and aquatic species that are mobile, they tend to have bilateral symmetry, and that allows them, especially with like the aquatic animals, they have this what's called like a fusiform shape. So think of like a torpedo shape. So if you look at like a seal when it's swimming, it has kind of a torpedo shape. And that reduces drag on the body as it moves through the water. So that allows the animal to swim easier through the water and produce less drag when it's moving through it. Land-dwelling animals, we're mainly constrained by gravity. So, we have to worry about the effects of gravity onto our bodies. So, the heavier our body mass is, the more, it's going to be harder for us to move because of that. So here's a picture from your textbook, or a figure from your textbook, and it basically shows the assortment of speeds based on some different animals that are land-based and aquatic-based. So you can kind of see the differences. So we know that the cheetah is, the fastest animal as far as a land-dwelling creature. It can run the fastest, so it can reach maximum speeds of 70 miles per hour. Whereas something like a shark, so a short fin mako shark, it can reach about 31 miles per hour when it's swimming. Okay, dolphins about 20 to 25 miles per hour. So you can see kind of the differences between some of our land-dwelling creatures. The horses, they're a lot bigger than a cheetah, but they can still reach almost 50 miles per hour. But something like a human, we're bigger than a cheetah, but smaller than a horse, and we max that at about 28 miles per hour at the maximum. Cats are faster than us, okay? Which, if you have a cat, you know they can outrun you. Little mouse, despite its small body, it can run pretty fast. I mean, 8 miles per hour for that tiny little thing, that's pretty fast for considering how small it is, okay? And then if we compare that to our aquatic species, dolphins and sharks, these two species are close to the same size, but the shark can outswim it. Okay, so kind of interesting. And then you see here the poor snail. It's an animal, but it moves at a very slow snail's pace, right? So it does what it can. Okay, so let's talk about the limits to the shape of the body and the size. So speaking of snails, we know that a lot of our animals have exoskeletons. So what is an exoskeleton? That would be a hard covering or shell that protects against the predators and water loss. And it also provides attachment for muscles. So you can see here in this diagram, we actually have the exoskeleton here, what we call these ingrows, apodemes. They are little attachment sites for muscles. So you can see the muscle, here's like a crab claw, and muscles will attach to these little spots on the exoskeleton. Okay. One thing that limits the size of our insects and arachnids and basically all the arthropods is that when they are growing, the new exoskeleton must be synthesized underneath the old one. Okay, so basically, if you've ever gone to the beach along the coastline and you come across what looks like a crab laying there on the beach, it's molt, right? You see the shed of it. And so what happened is the crab outgrew its exoskeleton, and then the new exoskeleton was growing underneath, and then it molted and shed its old exoskeleton. But because of this process, there's some downfalls to that. So the exoskeleton that's being synthesized underneath is still soft at the time. So when it sheds its exterior exoskeleton, it can be more vulnerable to predation. It also limits the ability for the animal to continuously grow. So unlike us, as organisms that don't have exoskeletons, from the time that we're inside our mother's belly to age 18 or something like that, we're continuously growing, and we don't need to sit there and molt our skin and then have another form of us come out underneath it and then stay that size for a bit and then molt our skin and have another version of us underneath it. Okay, so having that exoskeleton does limit the ability of these arthropods, these insects and scorpions and crustaceans and things like that, from growing. So they can't continuously grow like we do. Also, the thickness of the exoskeleton increases by the weight. So in order to protect the organism, so the exoskeleton does increase significantly to accommodate an increase in the weight of the organism. So if the body size is doubled, the doubling of the body size increases the body weight by a factor of 8. Okay, so that's pretty necessary in order for to support that particular organism. So that's why a lot of, if you think about insects and crustaceans and things like that, they're pretty small in size, and it's mainly because they can't be too big, otherwise their exoskeleton is going to be really, really thick, and it's going to weigh them down too much. Okay. Animals like us, we have endoskeletons, so we have our skeletal system. And so that allows us to grow continuously, so that's a pro. As our body increases, both our bone and muscle mass increase along with us. However, speed is balanced between the overall size and bone and muscle that provide support for movement. So if we are very muscular and very heavy due to, big bones and big muscles and things like that, it might affect our speed. Okay, so if you think of, for example, like an elephants, they're really large terrestrial animals, and they have a lot of muscle and a lot of bone, and they weigh a lot, and they can reach, pretty significant speeds. I think they're around 20 miles per hour, something like that, but not like a cheetah. Okay, and so that's because just the sheer size and volume of their bodies make it more difficult for them to achieve those speeds. Okay, so they're limited based on that. Okay. Another thing that we have to think about when we're looking at the size and the shape of the animal is the effects of diffusion. Okay, so we need to interact with the environment. That's one of our characteristics of life. And so we have to exchange nutrients and waste between our cells and the environment through diffusion. And so our cells are bathed in a watery environment. So if we go inside of our bodies, it's pretty liquid, right? We're 70% water. And so we have to have, this process of diffusion that allows nutrients to enter our cells and waste products to leave our cells. But diffusion is effective over a specific distance, and it's limited in size. Okay, so if the cell's too large, then the interior of the cell is not going to get enough nutrients, and too much waste products will develop, and it will have a hard time getting rid of it. So here's just an example of the size comparison. So imagine you have 1 millimeter sized cell versus a 2 millimeter sized cell. So the 2 millimeter sized cell, there's extra area here that's going to, you're going to have to get the nutrients down deep into the center of the cell. So it's going to have to go through a lot further distance to get all the way into the cell to, do whatever it needs to do inside. Okay, whereas a smaller cell doesn't have, it has a larger surface area to volume ratio in order to get the nutrients into the cell, or into the center of the cell, I should say. If there's waste products being produced in the center of this cell, it's a longer distance to get the waste products out to the surface to be expelled. Okay, so the larger the cell, the more inefficient diffusion is. Okay, so that limits the size of the cell itself. And that's why we don't see cells getting too large for the most part. Most cells that we know we see, you have to use a microscope to see them, right? So other than like chicken eggs and things like that, most cells are microscopic. And the reason for that is because of this diffusion factor. And so that, again, has to do with our surface area to volume ratio of a sphere. And so as we increase in size, the radius would increase. So the surface area to volume ratio would increase. And so the surface area to volume ratio is 3 divided by R, or radius. Okay, so as the cell gets bigger, its surface to volume ratio decreases, and that makes it less efficient. So the surface area is larger on a smaller cell. The volume is, it's going to be larger total. The smaller the cell, or the larger the cell, the smaller the surface area to volume ratio is. Volume ratio decreases as the cell gets larger. And I think we did an activity on that way back in the beginning of the term when we were talking about cells. So we learned that the smaller cells have a larger surface area to volume ratio. The larger cells have a smaller surface area to volume ratio. And so instead of making our cells bigger, what do? We become multicellular. Okay, so even though we're fairly large creatures, we're made of trillions of cells, and so each one of our cells is relatively small in size. It's microscopic, and that still allows this large surface area to volume ratio. But we can still, have plenty of diffusion going on and everything like that, but also be a complex organism. Okay, so that's due to the fact that we are multicellular. So specialization occurs in complex organisms. So some cells have certain tasks that other cells don't, and vice versa. And so it allows cells to become more efficient at doing fewer tasks. Okay, so we have, for example, the cells on our skin. They have a different task than the cells in our lungs, and the cells in our brains, and the cells in that line our heart, and so forth. So each cell has a different task, and so its specialization occurs. And then finally we get to the topic of animal bioengineerics. So another thing that we learned from the beginning of the term is that energies must obtain their energy. So how do we obtain our energy as animals? We must either ingest or absorb our food. So we as humans, we ingest our food, but not all animals ingest their food. Some of them absorb it, such as like the sponge that we talked about earlier. They kind of absorb it through their pores. And so the nutrients that we obtain from our food products then are converted to ATP. We learned about that with cellular respiration, and then are stored for short-term usage. And then our cells can use that ATP for cellular as a cellular energy source. And so when we're talking about the transfer of energy from, for example, our food to ATP, that transfer is not 100% efficient, okay? So every time we convert energy from one form to another, based on the second law of thermodynamics, which we talked about earlier in the term, there will be some loss along the way. The conversion will not be 100% efficient. And so that loss of energy is in the form of heat. And so our animals' metabolism, remember metabolism is the collection of all the chemical reactions that are occurring inside the body, it produces waste energy in the form of heat. So some animals, like endotherms, like us, we're capable of maintaining a relatively constant internal body temperature by harnessing that heat. Okay, so we use that heat to keep ourselves warm. And so all of those chemical reactions that are occurring inside our body, we try to conserve that heat inside of us to keep our body around the same body temperature all the time. Okay, so we use things like fur or fat or feathers to help conserve that body heat. So even though the temperature outside might be, 32 degrees, inside our bodies, it's still pretty warm. It's still, 97 degrees. And that's due to us holding on to, the heat that's being produced from all those chemical reactions and keeping our temperature constant. So we are what we call endothermic. So think within the body, the body is endotherms. Ectotherms are the opposite. So they are incapable of maintaining relatively constant internal body temperatures. So they still undergo chemical reactions just like we do, but they don't maintain a constant internal body temperature. So their body temperature fluctuates throughout the day based on the body, the temperature of the environment. So for example, if you think of a lizard, in the morning hours, you might see a lizard basking in the sun. And so it's dependent on the environment for its body heat. So it's heating up in the sun. And so that way, its muscles can start getting moving and so forth just by, heating up from the sunlight. But, at night, the lizard's not going to be moving around much because it's pretty cold. Okay, its body temperature has declined to a point where, it won't be able to move very well during the cold temperatures. So it's a different, strategy. So ectotherms, they have a variable body temperature throughout the day, and their body temperature is dependent on the environment. Okay, endotherms, their body temperature is constant throughout the day, and they conserve their body heat through fur, feathers, and fat. Okay, so they maintain their body temperature. Okay. Now, there's some trade-offs with the different life strategies. So if we take a look at our metabolic rates, the metabolic rate is the amount of energy expended by an animal over a specific time. And so we can calculate that by looking at, what type of nutrients are in our foods and things like that. So carbohydrates and proteins, by the way, they burn about 4.5 to 5 kilocalories per gram, so they have about that much energy per gram, compared to fats that have about 9 kilocalories per gram, so about twice as much kilocalories per gram. So fats, they are a better source of energy than carbohydrates and proteins, for example. Now, if we're looking at the amount of energy that we require, we can look at what's called a basal metabolic rate, a BMR, or a standard metabolic rate, an SMR. So the only difference is that the basal metabolic rate is for endothermic animals, and a standard metabolic rate is for ectothermic animals. And so this is just the metabolic rate at rest. Okay, so this is not including, any exercise that you do. So for human males, it takes about 1,600 to 1,800 kilocalories per day just to maintain your normal body. Okay, so that's breathing, that's, blood circulating, things like that, just at rest. Okay, so you're not exercising. You need about 1,600 to 1,800 kilocalories per day. So your body burns about that amount just doing its everyday activity. For human females tend to be smaller in size, have less body mass. So at rest, females tend to burn about 1,300 to 1,500 kilocalories per day. Okay, so just without doing any activities whatsoever, you need to consume, about that amount of calories per day just to maintain yourselves. Okay, look at what an alligator needs. Okay, so an alligator at rest only burns about 60 kilocalories per day. So you can see the difference in how much energy expenditure there is between endothermic and ectothermic animals. So endothermic animals, because we need to maintain a constant internal thermostat at about 97 degrees, it takes a lot of energy to maintain that. Okay, so 1,600 calories, that's quite a bit of energy that we need to do constantly. Okay, so you can see the metabolic rate of an endotherm is a lot higher at rest than an ectotherm. Ectotherms, they don't have to waste a bunch of calories keeping themselves warm. Okay, they just use the environment to heat up. So the alligator, if you know anything about ectothermic animals such as our reptile friends, they don't need to eat a lot, right? I had a ball python once, and I only fed him a rat maybe once a week. Okay, can you imagine just eating once a week? You'd be really, really hungry. So ectothermic animals, they can survive longer periods of time without food than endothermic animals because they can obtain their heat from their environment instead of producing it themselves through their metabolic activities. Okay, so that's a little bit of a downfall for endothermic animals, is that we require more food, okay? And that might be more difficult in areas of limited resources, okay? Another thing that we can look at is size comparisons. So the smaller the endothermic animals are, they have a greater surface area for their mass. And so because they have a greater surface area, they are more likely to lose heat faster than the larger animal. Okay, so for example, if we look at a little, is this a vole? Like some sort of, rodent species here. It has a smaller surface area. And so it's going to be, 35 grams. Its metabolic rate is going to be a lot higher than, say, an elephant that is, 4.5 million grams. Okay, so its metabolic rate is going to be a lot higher because it's losing heat faster to the environment. So it needs to maintain its body temperature by producing more energy. Okay, so it has a higher BMR than the larger endothermic animal. Okay, so you can see its body rate, its metabolic rate is a lot higher. And then, of course, the more active an animal is, the more energy it's needed to maintain their activity. So the higher its BMR or SMR is, depending on if it's an endothermic or ectothermic animal. So the average daily rate of energy consumption is usually about 2 to 4 times an animal's BMR or SMR. Okay, so if the basal metabolic rate is just at rest. Okay, so if we have adult males need about 1,600 to 1,800 kilocalories just at rest. Okay, that's just for maintenance. Okay, that doesn't include any additional activity. So most animals need about 2 to 4 times their BMR. Okay, so a squirrel, if its squirrel's BMR is 200, kilocalories, then it needs 2 to 4 times that in order to survive, because it's a very active animal. Especially, if you look around, they're moving around all day long. They're searching, running around, getting food and chasing each other and things like that. So they're going to be more active, and because they're more active, they're going to have they're going to need to consume a lot more energy than just their regular BMR. Okay, humans, we lead a fairly sedentary lifestyle, so our BMR, we need about 1.5 times our BMR. Okay, so if you're, an active male and your BMR is, 1,600, then you need to consume about 2,400 calories, just due to the amount of activity that you do in a day. For females, if you are fairly active, you're close to about 2,000 kilocalories per day. Okay. So that's just taking the BMR and multiplying it by 1.5. So because, we're not quite as active as, say, a squirrel or a bird or something like that. Okay. And then finally, a lot of our energy requirements are related to the environments that we live in, and so a lot of animals have adapted to extremes of temperature or food availability through something called torpor. So torpor is a process that leads to a decrease in activity and metabolism and allows animals to survive adverse conditions. Okay, so it's just basically you can kind of go into a resting mode where sometimes it even allows your body to lower its temperature if you're an endotherm, so that you can kind of reduce the amount of your metabolism, your chemical reactions, and during a time when there's limited food or the temperature is really really cold. So there's a couple of terms that are related to torpor. So torpor can just be just a day-to-day thing. So this could be just for example, like during a really really cold snap, the hummingbird might lower its body temperature just a little bit to be able and to reduce its dependence on the food and so forth when it's really cold. Okay, so it could just do that on a day-to-day basis. Hibernation is torpor over a long period of time. Okay, so think of how, for example, if you have a, like here in our household, we have a bearded dragon, and bearded dragons, they don't, ours doesn't necessarily go through hibernation, but some people do report that their bearded dragons do, where basically they don't really eat much for, or they don't eat at all for like a month. Ours does, so he hasn't actually reached hibernation. But if you have like a tortoise or something like that, that basically he just goes to sleep for the winter, and he doesn't actually eat anything. So that's just a way that some animals, they can survive long periods of time, during cold winters, and their metabolism basically just shuts down to a really low point where they minimize their activities. They have low metabolisms, their temperature drops and things like that, and they basically go through a long winter sleep. Okay, now contrary to what you may think, bears do not hibernate. I looked in your OpenStax textbook, and it even alluded to a little bit. I think it said something like, the body temperature of the bear, if you notice, it doesn't decrease much during winter time. So it actually doesn't hibernate. It will go in, the bears go into their caves in the winter time, and they'll sleep a lot, but they do wake up and they do move around. And even if you think about female bears, they give birth during this time, so they're definitely awake during that. So yeah, hibernation, that's when you go to sleep for a long period of time. Okay, bears, they don't hibernate because they are awake during the winter time months. They just sleep a lot more, and their body temperatures might decrease a little bit, but not to the point where their metabolisms are very very low. Okay, estivation is basically hibernation during hot temperatures and low water availability. So it's a way that organisms, if it's a very hot time period, particularly desert regions, areas that are, have really high temperatures and not very much water availability, they can go into estivation, where they can slow their metabolisms, they can decrease their activity, and so that they can survive on minimal water availability and live through that extreme period of high heat temperatures. Okay, so estivation, we do see that in some of our mammals. They kind of go through that, like pocket mice and things like that. They'll go through estivation in the deserts. So they kind of bury themselves underground and stay cool, and go to sleep for a while during the extreme temperatures. Okay. All right, so now we're going to go through some terminology in relation to how we reference body positions. Okay, so we're going to look at our body planes and our cavities. So we have two pictures here as reference. So we do have, our four-legged creature, a goat, and then our two-legged, walk on two legs human being. So, for the purposes of your anatomy physiology courses later on, most of you are going into adult or human medicine. Some of you might be thinking about veterinary medicine, so you might focus in on the four-legged creatures as well. But for the purposes of this class, you might want to focus in, again, if you're going into human medicine, on the planes for looking at the human being, and it might apply better for you. So when we're talking about the different planes, we have three types or three positions that we can basically cut the human in three places we can cut them. So the first one would be the sagittal plane. So the sagittal plane divides the body from right to left, okay, or the goat from right to left. And so depending on where we're cutting it, if we're cutting it along the middle, the exact middle of the human, then we can get equal right side to left side. That's called the mid-sagittal plane. But, it depends on where it's cut. If it's cut off of the arm, then that would just be a sagittal plane. Okay, so mid-sagittal divides the middle, to receive two equal halves. Okay, so sagittal, cuts the sides, the right and the left. Frontal plane, so imagine we're cutting right down the center to separate the front of you from the back of you. Okay, so this is also known as the coronal plane. Okay, so the frontal plane or the coronal plane separates the front from the back. Okay, so you can see how it's dividing. And then the transverse plane is basically cutting you from the half from your lower extremities from your upper extremities. Okay, so the transverse or horizontal plane. Now notice this is different from the animal. So if you're going into the veterinary specialties, then you can see the frontal plane, okay, is like the transverse plane on the human, and the transverse plane is like the frontal plane on the human. Okay, so just be aware it's backwards. All right, but just realize you're not really going to be tested on animal planes in this class. We're focusing more on humans, but just if you are into veterinary medicine, it's just the opposite. Okay. And then for our cavities, vertebrates have a number of defined body cavities. So we're going to focus in on, we have the dorsal and the ventral cavities. So the dorsal cavities, they include the cranial cavity. So that encapsulates and remember dorsal is like the back, the ventral is the front, the abdominal side, dorsal, the back side. So the cranial cavity, of course, houses the brain, okay? And then the vertebral cavity is also known as the spinal cavity, so that contains the vertebral column, okay, or the backbone. So that cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity encapsulate the dorsal cavity, the back side, okay? So imagine if we did our frontal plane, okay, so this would be the back, the dorsal part of our frontal plane. The ventral part of our frontal plane would include our thoracic and our abdominal pelvic cavities. Okay, so the thoracic cavity, so if we're looking at like the transverse plane, that would be the upper part, okay, the superior part. So the thoracic cavity includes what's known as the pleural cavity. So pleural cavity surrounds the lungs. And then the pericardial cavity, so think cardial means heart, so around, peri means around, pericardial cavity surrounds the heart. So pleural cavity, lungs, pericardial cavity, heart. And that's in the thoracic cavity. Okay, so that's basically encapsulates, your ribs, under your ribs, okay? And then you have your abdominal pelvic cavity, so that can be divided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. So abdominal cavity is superior to the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity is inferior. All right. So those are the different cavities, and you'll learn more about these in your lab. Okay, so we'll have all the anatomy portion in your lab. All right, and if you notice, I was using the terms superior and inferior just for placement. So you'll learn about that in your lab as well. Okay, so we're going to do some review questions. So which type of animal maintains a constant internal temperature? Is it A, the endotherm, B, the ectotherm, C, the coelomates, or D, the mesoderms? Just like our penguins, it would be the endotherm. So birds are endotherms, like us mammals. So we are endotherms. Okay, so A, endotherm. Here's another review question. The symmetry found in animals that move swiftly is A, radial, B, bilateral, C, sequential, or D, interrupted. So what would be the symmetry found in swiftly moving animals, such as our cheetah? Obviously that would be bilateral, B, okay? Definitely not radial there, okay? So bilateral. Here's another review question. What term describes the condition of a desert mouse that lowers its metabolic rate and sleeps during the hot day? Would it be A, turgid, B, hibernation, C, estivation, or D, normal sleep pattern? If you said C, estivation, I would agree with you. So remember, estivation is during the hot, dry periods. Hibernation is more during the cold, long stretches of time. And then we have a plane that divides an animal into equal right and left portions. Would that be A, diagonal, B, mid-sagittal, C, coronal or frontal, or D, transverse? So separating the goat from its left and right side would be a mid-sagittal plane. B would be the correct answer. And then finally, a plane that divides an animal into dorsal and ventral portions. Would that be A, sagittal, B, mid-sagittal, C, coronal or frontal, or D, would it be transverse? If you said C, coronal, otherwise known as frontal, I would agree with you. So just recognize that we do have alternate terms for some of these. Your textbook, OpenStax, gave you coronal, but it also talked about frontal as the same term. So just be aware of that. So if we're separating dorsal, remember dorsal for us would be our back, ventral would be our front, okay, our stomach, our abdominal region, okay? So think, front, back. What separates that would be the coronal or frontal plane, okay? So C is the correct answer. And then we have the pleural cavity is a part of which cavity? Is it A, the dorsal cavity, B, the thoracic cavity, C, the abdominal cavity, or D, the pericardial cavity? So where is the pleural cavity? So it's found in, if you said B, thoracic cavity, I would agree with you. So the thoracic cavity is in the pleural cavity, it's part of that ventral cavity. Okay, so we have the dorsal cavity that's in the back with the cranial and the vertebral cavities, and then we have the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities in the ventral cavities, and they are the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity are both in the thoracic. Remember, the pleural cavity surrounds the lungs. Okay. How could the increasing global temperature associated with climate change impact ectotherms? Okay, so would it A, ectotherm diversity will decrease in cool regions? B, ectotherms will be able to be active all day in the tropics? C, ectotherms will have to expend more energy to cool their body temperatures? Or D, ectotherms will be able to expand into new habitats? So what do you predict will happen to our ectotherm friends with the increasing global temperature? If you said D, I would agree with you. Ectotherms will be able to expand into new habitats. So as the global temperature increases, that means that these creatures that rely on the external environment to heat themselves will find new habitats that they can expand into due to that heating of the temperatures. Okay, so they'll be able to expand into those new territories. So D is the correct answer. And I think this is the last one. So although most animals are bilaterally symmetrical, a few exhibit radial symmetry. So what is an advantage of radial symmetry? Is it A, it confuses predators, B, it allows the animal to gather food from all sides, C, it allows the animal to undergo rapid, purposeful movement in any direction, or D, it lets an animal use its dorsal surface to sense the environment? So what's an advantage of having radial symmetry? If you said B, it allows the animal to gather food from all sides, I would agree with you. Okay, so something like the sea urchin, it can, even though, it's a little different, it's got pokey things all over itself, most radially symmetrical organisms, they are able to take in food from all sides of its body. So B would be the correct answer. All right, so we've just completed section 11.2 from our textbook, Animal Form and Function. So by now you should be able to describe the various types of body planes that occur in animals, so asymmetrical, radial, and bilateral. You should describe the limits, be able to describe the limits on animal size and shape. Okay, so think about the surface area to volume ratios, as well as the ectoskeletons and endoskeletons, and the BMR and the SMR, relating bioengineerics to body size, level of activity, and the environment. Okay, so all of those were covered in our video. So for the next video, we're going to get into 11.3, which talks about animal primary tissues.